Hi again. In this unit, I want to begin by giving you a brief overview of the 6 steps of outlining that we're going to be using during the rest of this course. Now, there are certainly many different ways of outlining, and they all have their merits, they all have their validity, but the one that we're going to be exploring together over the next little while has 6 steps. And those steps are, step number 1, the 3-phrase beginning, middle, end. Step number 2, the premise. Step number 3, the swill outline. Step number 4, the rough outline. Step number 5, the outline. And step number 6, revisions of the outline. So over the next several units, I'll be going into detail on each of these steps, and you'll be going through each of these steps with the idea that you are generating for this course, so that by the time we get to the end of it, you will have gone through all of these steps, including several revisions of your outline, all of which is going towards helping you create a blueprint for the story that you want to tell. Now, a little bit more detail about step number 1, the 3-phrase beginning, middle, end. There's a lot of different ways to get started with an outline, but one possible way is to just jot down some basic ideas that correspond roughly to the beginning, the middle, and the end of your story, or the beginning, the middle, and the end of the arc or journey that your lead character is going to go through during the course of your story. You don't have to worry about your word choice. These don't have to be complete sentences, just thoughts that roughly structure the beginning, the middle, end. So one little phrase that corresponds to the beginning of the story, one phrase that corresponds to the middle, and one phrase that corresponds to the end. So you might find yourself saying, I know I have an idea for my story. I want to get to writing my outline. Why should I take the time to write a 3-phrase beginning, middle, end? Why should I write 3 words or 3 phrases when I'm chomping at the bit here to get to my story? I want to get to my outline. Well, the whole point of these 6 steps towards an outline is to take baby steps towards your outline. And so the first few steps really are going to feel like baby steps, but there's a reason for it. I'd like to give you another quote from John Vorhaus, who again is very eloquent on this subject. Here's what he says. It's easier to inflate than create. That's why we take the time to develop stories in stages. Rather than invent what we need whole and complete in the instant, we reinvent what we already have, expanding it a level at a time and a comfortable chunk at a time. It's a relaxed and manageable approach to a writing task that can seem horribly huge and arguably insanely unmanageable. Now, let me just reiterate what John Vorhaus is saying here. What he's saying is, if you have an idea in your head and you have to spit it out as an outline, a 10-page document, a 15-page document that's scene by scene, that's going to really tell the story all in pieces, it can be quite a daunting task, or as he calls it, arguably insanely unmanageable, because it's such a big task and you get stuck. Well, I don't know what's going to happen here and I don't know what choice to make there. So if you start small, if you start in manageable chunks, in little pieces, and build and build and build, and that's what we're going to be doing. We're going to be starting with small pieces and inflating rather than creating. As John Vorhaus says, it's easier to inflate than create. That's why we take the time to develop stories in stages. Rather than invent what we need whole and complete in the instant, we reinvent what we already have, expanding it a level at a time and a comfortable chunk at a time. It's a relaxed and manageable approach to a writing task that can seem horribly huge and arguably insanely unmanageable. So that's a very clear explanation of why we're doing this outlining in stages, in levels, in chunks. It's to make it manageable, to make something that can be scary and daunting, and you can get lost in the middle of it trying to solve all of these issues and answer all the questions. and we're going to take it just a piece at a time. So, do yourself a favor, keep remembering the phrase, don't start writing until your outline is rock solid, but let's go right to the very beginning and start small. Your 3-phrase beginning, middle, ends. They're simple. Write a ton of them. Ideas will start to come to you, and when we get to the next section, you'll be able to expand on those ideas, and in each unit we'll expand and expand and expand until you really have an idea that's fleshed out and compelling and interesting. So embrace this opportunity to explore these little bits and pieces along the way, and really think about those 3-phrase beginning, middle, ends as an exploration tool that's going to lead you to the next step. Now, in addition to exploring the 6 steps towards an outline that we'll be using for this entire course, I also want to touch along the way on some basic storytelling techniques, playwriting 101, if you will, and how those techniques impact on your outline and how you structure your story. Now, I want to start with conflict, because you certainly can't have a story without conflict. Well, you can have a story without conflict, but it's not going to be a very interesting one. For example, Sweeney Todd. What does Sweeney Todd want? He wants revenge. What does he do to get it? He goes to the judge's house and kills him. And curtain. Story over. It's not going to be a very interesting story because there's nothing opposing the lead character. You give your lead character a strong want, and then you put opposition in his way. Storytelling 101. Now, I want to talk about 3 basic types of conflict that you can be looking for to apply at the outline level. They are man versus his world, man versus his society, and man versus himself. And that's exactly what it sounds like. Man versus his world is things like man struggling against basically natural forces. The weather, a flood is coming, the house is falling down, an earthquake, those sorts of grand scale conflicts. The rainmaker, for instance, they're faced with drought. So that's man versus his world. Man versus society. That would be personal relationships, family, the society that he lives in, lover, spouse, children, conflicts in that area. And then man versus himself is an inner conflict. Dealing with your own personal prejudices, you're struggling with your belief in God, self-esteem, anything that's an inner turmoil like that. The other ways of calling those are extra-personal conflict, personal conflict, and inner conflict. Same 3 categories, just a different way to look at them. So man versus his world is an extra-personal conflict. It's outside of his person. It's in the larger world, the grand scheme of things. Man versus society is personal conflict because it's in my personal world, my family, my friends, my society. Man versus himself is inner conflict because that's inside of me. I'm fighting with myself, with my own beliefs or lack thereof. Now, it isn't always easy to exactly separate these conflicts so that you can say very clearly, my character is now going through a conflict with his world, or he is now going through a conflict with himself. It isn't always easy to completely separate them. They tend to overlap. The only reason for the distinction is it could be something you're using thematically. If you thematically want to explore what happens to a man when he's pitted against society, that doesn't mean you aren't going to use conflicts, inner conflicts and world conflicts at the same time. Rainmaker, for instance, there's a drought, so you can look at that as man versus his world, because part of the reason that they're having the problems they're having in this town is because of the lack of rain. However, certainly Lizzie is also having a great deal of personal conflict, or man or woman versus society, because her father and her brothers think that she should be getting married, and she hasn't been able to find the right person, and so she has that kind of conflict. You could take that another step and say she has inner conflict, that she has personal conflict. Man versus himself. Sorry, not personal. Man versus himself, which is inner conflict. See, it's confusing. Because she doesn't believe in herself. And the show really is very much about Starbuck helping her find a way to believe that she's a person who's worthy of having a husband and a family and a home, and that there isn't something wrong with her because she's an old maid. So that's a perfect example of a show that uses all three of those conflicts quite well. At the outline level, there's no reason why you have to pick only one of those, but you might want to structure, for instance, your three-phrase beginning, middle, end to correspond to one of them at a time, because it might help you clarify the story. So if you were going to define your conflict, in the case of the Rainmaker, as man versus the world, then your three-phrase beginning, middle, end would relate to that. So it would be beginning, drought, middle, struggle against drought, and then end, the rain comes. So you would be that would be one way of looking at a three-phrase beginning, middle, end that's relating specifically to a man versus society, a man versus world conflict. If you wanted to define the conflict as man versus society, and still looking at the Rainmaker, then your beginning, middle, end phrases might be something more like, see, if it's a problem with her family, then it's going to be family disapproval. Beginning could be the family disapproves. Middle could be exploring possibilities with Starbuck. And then the end could be settling down and finding a home. So it just slightly changes the way of looking at the story. Same story, it just tends to focus the thoughts in the story development in a slightly different way. If you were going to define that story as inner conflict, man versus himself, then your three-phrase beginning, middle, end might be something more like beginning, self-doubt, middle, blossoming, and end, maturity. Now, another way to approach the idea of creating conflict or force of opposition for your lead character is to put your lead character in a situation where he has to choose between two things that he really, really wants, but he can't have both. That's a great way to set up a compelling conflict. There are two equally good things, but your lead can't have both of them. He has to pick one. An example of that would be Maria from The Sound of Music. She loves God and wants to be a nun, but then she falls in love with the captain and his children. Is she going to devote her life to God, or is she going to devote her life to Captain Von Trapp and the children? They're both good, wonderful things that she loves, but she has to pick one. She can't have them both. Another example of that would be in West Side Story. Maria has to choose between her family and Tony, because her family doesn't approve of Tony. So if she goes with him, she loves him, but if she goes with him, she's going to incur the wrath of her family. So that's a difficult choice to make. Another example is Frederick from A Little Night Music. He has to choose between his 18-year-old virginal bride, Anne, and the sexy older woman from his past, Desiree. They're both really interesting to him, and he loves both of them, but he certainly can't have both of them. So that sets up a conflict when he is in a situation where he has to choose between them. And then the flip side of that is, can you put your lead character in a situation where he has to choose between two things that he doesn't want? Has to pick the lesser of two evils, if you will. That might be even more interesting, because neither of these choices are going to be good, but he's got to pick one. An example would be in Fiddler on the Roof. Does Tevye decide? Is Tevye going to stay in Anatevka, where there might be another pogrom, the Russians might come and kill them any moment? Or does he pack up his entire family and leave for a country he knows nothing about and face the unknown? Those are equally bad choices, but he has to pick one of them. Another example of that would be Oliver. Oliver is hungry. He is faced with either staying hungry, which is not a good choice, or asking for food, which he knows is going to be a problem. He's got to pick one or the other. Wicked is another situation where Elphaba has to decide between dealing with a corrupt world that has really disappointed her, or becoming wicked. And those are both difficult choices, and they're both going to cause problems for her. She's got to pick one of them. That's a great source of conflict. So as you're writing your three-phrase beginning, middle, ends, think about how these basic ideas are going to interact with conflict to create an interesting story for you to develop in the next few units.